We know that marine ecosystems, again, recently mapped all over the world, especially coastal areas, are already degraded. There is a recent paper on Nature declaring the high costs of restoration of deep sea habitats after deep sea mining. There are hot topics related to the exploitation of biotic, inorganic, mineral, gas, oil, food, and there is a need of seeing what we can do to afford these issues without releasing the cost of the tax of the economic activities on shoulders of the citizens. And this is why we define in this section number 4, some issues related to the potential from a different point of view, with the perspectives of the science and the evaluations available for the ecosystem restoration. The session is what prospect for marine ecosystem restoration industry driven by science and innovation, and it's a real honor for me to call Dave Billett to open the first call on the deep sea environmental solutions. Dave Billett is the managing director of Deep Sea Environmental Solutions, and is presenting a talk on marine ecosystem restoration and the economy of the ecosystem. Thanks, Dave, for being here. Floor to you.
Okay, when it appears. So while the talk is appearing, yes, I run my own consultancy company now, having worked for about 36 years at the National Oceanography Centre and its predecessors as a deep sea ecologist, and left there to run my own company. So those are my two major affiliations. The other one, of course, is for the Mercies project, which Roberto is leading on marine ecosystem restoration from or until June 2020, when the project ends. Now, you may have also noticed in the introduction that it says member of ISA on the list, and I have to say that I am no longer a member of the International Seabed Authority. I was a member of a group called the Legal and Technical Commission, which was a group of about 25 experts in various aspects of law and resources and the environment that advised the Council of the International Seabed Authority on the decisions that it had to take. But you're only allowed to serve 2 5-year terms, and my time came to an end in January this year. So that has two good things. One is I can say whatever I say has nothing to do with the International Seabed Authority, and you mustn't say to them, oh, Dave Billett said this. Secondly, it means that now I'm no longer a member of the International Seabed Authority. I can say almost all sorts of things I'd like to say that maybe I couldn't last year. So there are two advantages. Now, what I'm going to do is basically take you on a short journey starting on the coastal region, where there are various aspects of marine restoration that are very active and useful to know about, and perhaps good models for other activities. And then we're going to pass through the shelf seas and the various types of users that we've seen already in talks today, and maybe stopping also where in areas where rather than what oil and gas are going to do about rigs to reefs, maybe what is being done or should have been done in relation to oil spills and risks, and how ecosystems might be restored following accidents, and whether we should plan rather better for it. And I'm going to end up in the deepest parts of the oceans, talking about deep sea mining and the emerging interest there for things like polymetallic nodules and massive sulfides in the deep ocean to fuel our computers and our display equipment and your phones. So it's a very brief and fast journey, and actually I'm going to skip one slide because you've dealt with so expertly with the rigs to reefs this morning and the marine spatial planning that I don't have to talk about that. So the first thing I would like to highlight is, say, this particular project, which is on the area near the Bristol Channel. It's on the northern coast of a county called Somerset. And this area was farmland, and it just flooded every year. And it was very low-grade farmland. in many ways. But there are also, as you can't see in this shot, along this side, some rather expensive real estate as well in this rather beautiful part. And the problem was, how are we going to protect all this from rising waters and sea level? And what's the best way of doing that, and the cheapest and most cost-effective? And that led to this notion of nature-based solutions, or building with nature, you'll often see in the literature, for flood defence, where by building new ramparts behind the existing area, it can be protecting the real estate and the farmland behind, but the rest of the area is allowed to flood and then builds up as a salt marsh and protects the as a natural barrier for the future. And this picture was taken soon after the cutting was made into the river here, and you can still see that it's farmland underneath here. And I visited this area last year, 2 years after this photograph was taken, and I certainly wouldn't know that it wasn't a salt marsh anymore, although it's a rather depauperated salt marsh. So the changes happen, as you'd expect, rather quickly. So there are advantages to trying to restore natural areas for flood defence, but the work now being done and in other areas is actually showing that there are also enhancement for fisheries through stimulating nursery areas for fish. There is also the sequestration of harmful pollutants and nutrients that come from agricultural runoff and industrial processes. And there can also be a lot of carbon sequestered naturally into the sediments and into the actual vegetation in these areas. And that has caught the attention of what you may have heard and talk about in a blue carbon initiative, which is the importance of mangrove forests, seagrass meadows and tidal salt marshes the world over in the carbon budgets of these areas and how important they are. And part of that comes from a report that you'll find by the Climate Institute on blue carbon and how carbon trading can help preserve coastal ecosystems. And what you can see here at the top is the amount of gram carbon per metre squared per year that is sequestered, comparing tropical forests and boreal forests with the salt marshes, mangroves and seagrasses, and how, because they not only take it into their vegetation but they trap it in the sediments, how important they are to carbon sequestration. And it was only through going through the Mercies project that I suddenly became aware myself of this, and the importance of some companies now selling to developing nations how to improve and restore their seagrass meadows and mangroves in order to trap carbon and use it as part of carbon trading, where in the past they've turned it into aquaculture for shrimp farms, and now, because they've got over-polluted, can't use them anymore. And from that I also went into, or starting to go into, other areas of interest, which are insurance companies that are now looking at the risks from natural disasters for a developing nation if it was suddenly to lose its carbon and therefore its carbon trading power through some storm events that may carry it away overnight. So there are quite a lot of new interests in this particular area of science. And what became clear from when I visited this site in Somerset was that there is a meeting of minds. I think Mike Elliott said this morning of science and industry. Well, the meeting of minds is also with NGOs. The area is actually run by the Wildlife and Wetlands Trust for conservation. There's tourism opportunities, and the regulators and the local fishing authorities are all involved in this project, working together to drive ecosystem restoration. And this is only one example of quite a number going on around the world. So what chances of a restoration business? I would say, at least in this particular case, they're very high. They're actually doing it, and there's a lot more that could be done and business taken or made from it, particularly by knowledge-based consultancies. And if you're going to do that, we mustn't fall into the trap, as we already have, of saying, oh, it has to be all about fish farming for shrimp, and then suddenly say, oh, it's all about carbon sequestration. We should be doing a much better job in estimating all the marine ecosystem values. So you will find in the literature in recent years calculations about the value of enhancing seagrasses, providing euro values per hectare, from various ecosystem services, and coming up with surprising results. So the University of Gothenburg, in estimating the value of seagrasses and restoring seagrasses, has found that half of that value probably comes from the way that the sediments sequester pollutants and nutrients and stop eutrophication, which was a surprise because they thought it was all being fisheries. Fisheries and enhancement of fisheries was about 25%. But they certainly didn't look at all ecosystem services, and maybe those values need to be looked at again. We were talking also over lunch about how you would go about actually valuing these various services. And in the Mercy's newsletter, which you can get online, just search Mercy's Marine Ecosystem Restoration and look for newsletter 2, you'll find all sorts of case studies there. One of the companies that's heavily involved in this carbon trading put the calculation in, and you have to treat it with a little bit of sense of apprehension, but it may be right. So that basically every small plate of shrimp that you eat, say equivalent to maybe what you had last night at the reception, is equivalent to driving in your family car about 1,000 kilometers. So they're starting to try to, whether you believe it or not, to get a common currency between the various uses that might be in marine ecosystems. And I think this is an important, and there are other examples in the Mercy's newsletter of these sorts of activities now in marine restoration and their value. I'm going to skip the one to do with rigs to reefs, because you know all about that, except just to highlight that certainly in that part of the equation, then marine ecosystem restoration of an area, say the North Sea, perhaps back to what it was 200 years ago rather than 50 years, is one of the considerations that might be taken into account. One thing surprised me. I thought when I was looking for companies to entice into Mercy's, so I run a business club. All those businesses that should be interested in marine restoration registered with us, and we send them the newsletters, and we're organising webinars, and also have put their case studies, or in the process of putting their case studies onto our web pages, so that there's a central source of information on real work being done in marine ecosystem restoration. I thought perhaps the oil spill companies would be interested in this, because the methods that they might use will affect significantly how fast ecosystems after such an event might recover. And either it's to do with sort of years ago, the Sea Empress ship ran aground off West Wales, and they used high pressure hoses and blasted the oil off, and that was deemed to have done much more damage than maybe seeding the area with bacteria to eat the oil, and that the ecosystem would have returned much faster had they used that. And of course in the Gulf of Mexico there's a considerable amount of concern about the 5 million litres of dispersants that were added into the oil plume as it came out of the seabed, and that the dispersants might have been having a much greater ecosystem effect than the oil, where many of the bacteria in the Gulf of Mexico are actually used to natural oil seeping from the sea floor. And you'll find in Deep Sea Research 2, a special volume published last year, that people have been doing experiments and showing that the dispersants do have a toxic, a much bigger effect than the oil, and also the oil and dispersant mixtures. So there is a lot of concern about how we plan for enhancing ecosystem restoration when, unfortunately, we do have accidents, and those accidents generally are very large in scale and also long-lasting. But when I talk to the companies, they don't want to know. Their regulation, their reason for doing something is to get rid of the oil fast by whatever means they can, and there's no thought to the future. There's no, I hope I'm saying things right from those that are in the industry, there is very little thought to the future about using methods that might be more benign to the environment and make sure that restoration occurs faster. Okay, so I want to just go into deep sea mining, a bit more home territory for myself. And you may have seen this picture here in the press just 2 weeks ago. It was on a lot of the electronic press, of the Japanese mining machine that they've just been using in the last 2 or 3 months in a test case down at a depth of I think about 1,600 meters within the EEZ of Japan to mine areas where there are sulfide deposits being those associated with sort of hydrothermal formation, hydrothermal vents. So mining is something that's happening. There are other mining systems by Nautilus for use in Papua New Guinea which are still on the starting blocks but have been built, but which may be used quite soon. So mining is becoming more likely. So it would be wrong, I suppose, if for those that don't know about the mining, the first thing to really note is that there are 3 different sorts of reserve, and they all have impact different ecosystems, and they all have different effects depending on the size of the area and the ecosystems that they're associated with. The actual main impacts are the same. There's an impact of a mining machine grinding the seafloor or picking up the nodules. It then gets taken up to the surface in a pipe, is dewatered because you don't want all that water in it, which may be of a different temperature to the surface water, have lots of nutrients in an area that generally is oligotrophic, doesn't have much nutrients. So the discharge plume is generally thought it'll either go back to the seabed where the mining machine is, or will be released somewhere in mid-water. So these are the main impacts, and in fact those impacts are similar for whichever resource that you want to talk about. Now, I'm going to actually just focus this talk, it was at the time, on polymetallic nodules. So these are nodules that fit in the palm of your hand. They grow at about sort of 1 to 2 millimeters per million years. They grow exceptionally slowly. And once you take them away, they'll be gone, at least in human timescales. And that really does cause a problem, because one will then ask, well, what are the scale of these impacts? What's the scale of actually happening in terms of polymetallic nodule mining? This map shows the area between Hawaii on the left to the EEZ of Mexico on the right, and the rather complex jigsaw of contracts that is been sent by the International Seabed Authority to a number of different companies. To give you a sense of scale, this would be from the west to the east, like passing from Los Angeles, LA, to New York. It's the size of the United States of America, where all these concessions have been given. And the other thing to point out maybe at this stage is these big boxes with the hashed areas are areas that have been instigated as part of an environmental management plan, part of an MPA process, but they're not called MPAs because of the political difficulties in doing that. They're called APEIs, areas of particular environmental interest. And their total area is about the same as the area actually contracted out to contractors. It's about 1/3 of the total area. That's what we try to aim for in terms of preservation. And they're really to try and conserve the biodiversity of the region before any mining occurs. So what happens within any of these areas? So let's just highlight perhaps this area over here, right to the east. This is an area of about 75,000 square kilometres squared, licensed to UK seabed resources. And within that, or any of these particular areas of a similar size, the mining concern will probably want to mine about 30 to 50% of the seabed. In addition, if they don't control the plumes that arise from their operations, then an equivalent area of the seabed could be affected. Now, as you can see here, there are at least 14 different contractors which involve developed countries such as France and Germany and Japan and Korea, and also developing countries such as China and the Cook Islands, Kiribati, Nauru and Tonga. So it's quite a mixture of concerns. And if money is ever to be made out of this, then all members of the International Seabed Authority, all 166 nations that have signed up, will get an element of the royalty. So they're quite keen for mining to go ahead because the countries will all get some income. And while they say they're interested about the environment at the same time, then maybe money will talk. And at the moment, the International Seabed Authority is both gamekeeper and poacher in this particular case. So the take-home message is that if one mining machine disturbs, say, about 200 square kilometres of seabed per year, that is the size of Naples, per mining machine, per mining area, and they all went mining at the same time, and they mined over a period of about 30 years, then in terms of area impacted across here, the impacts will be considerable. So the question is, therefore, well, should they be planning, and what environmental planning should occur? As you know, we should plan first to avoid impacts, which is obviously impossible. We can minimize those impacts, say, by reducing the plumes. And in my opinion, and now looking at this, they should also be looking to ways that they might enhance the speed by which restoration may occur. The other element that you have to bear in mind is that we're now dealing with an area of the ocean where only about 1% of the organic matter that was at the sea surface actually reaches the bottom of the sea. It's a very food-poor and biomass-poor environment, but has very high biodiversity, lots of different organisms that potentially have other values. And this track that you can see here, which is about 1.5 meters wide and 10 centimeters deep, was just a test system to go and collect the nodules. It appears very fresh, but how old is it? Well, it's at least 26 years old. So the systems, reason why you get nodules on the seafloor is there's very low sedimentation, very little input, so they can grow at several millimeters per million years. But it also means that if organisms are going to recolonize after major impacts, it will also take a long time because biomass and processes are also low. So in the literature for restoration and where successful restoration has been advocated, what people have generally found is that if you take simple engineering solutions and then, as one of the authors says, you allow Mother Nature and Father Time to take over, that's where there's been greatest success in restoration of marine ecosystems. Don't try and be too clever is basically the message. The paper was actually titled, When Will Ecologists Learn Engineering and When Will Engineers Learn Ecology? In a rather sort of despairing title, but was actually quite good. And the problem for us, particularly in the deep ocean, is the question, well, if we are going to allow Father Time to take over, how might we actually speed it up? Because in the deep ocean, it may take hundreds of years rather than tens of years. This was partly also something we addressed in this paper that Roberto has already talked about ecological restoration in the deep sea. And this paper really highlighted the importance of, or the challenge of cost. That going to the deep sea, using sophisticated equipment that we've seen of AUVs and ROVs, is going to cost a lot of money, probably beyond the resources of any one particular nation. So we have to be mindful that actually sharing costs is going to be very important in international waters. And the other element that really doesn't come out in this paper, and I don't think we've made enough in the literature we have put out, is just how long it takes to do deep sea work. If I was to put a trawl in, it takes about 5 hours to get down to depths of 4,000 meters. I trawl it for 2 hours, and then it takes another 5 hours to come back up again. In any particular research cruise lasting 30 days on site with moving around, I can only do about 5 trawls. I can only really sample a very small way, and I can only build up knowledge by doing this over years of sampling and going back to the same area. So it's not just a matter of costs, it's just how to work in the deep sea is difficult and different to how we experience it in shallower water. And that's an important distinction to make too. So my final slide is one that you've seen already, and this led to a publication that we put out this year, led by Roberto, saying, well, really funding deep sea research to get to answers that we need that cover areas the size of the United States in the deep ocean, that can work at depths of 4,000 to 6,000 meters where it takes forever and an age to get there first and then to do any sampling, that will cost a lot of money and that involves really all nations through the International Seabed Authority. There must be a different and better way to fund the scientific research that's needed. So what chances of a restoration business in the deep ocean? Well, they're probably quite high. There's nothing there. But really what we need first is to say that what we need is a thorough and new way of funding deep ocean science to provide the answers upon which these major industries that want to use minerals of the deep ocean and feed all our electronic devices can operate. And that's the major question, major point, is that it's an international working. You can see it in Europe. Nations do already work closely together to do it, but we need to start to work as the Atlas project with America and Canada, and the key will be actually to start also working with the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and other nations that have resources that should come and put to bear to answer common questions. And that's our challenge. How can we get a restoring industry based on actually funding science and knowledge better? Thank you.
Director, Department for Marine Bioresources and Marine Research. She works at the Research Council of Norway, and she will talk about marine ecosystem restoration, industrial development. Thank you for being here. Christina.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to say I really enjoy this workshop. And I'm going to give some reflections on marine ecosystem restoration and opportunities of industrial development. And of course, I will pick up quite a few points that already been elaborated on. But first of all, I would also like to say that I really enjoyed being a part of this OECD project, Future of the Ocean Economy. And what I think was very interesting in that project is that it was stated that the value of the ocean-based industries are inextricably interlinked with the assets and services of marine ecosystems. So, but what is a healthy marine ecosystem? And what kind of species is it does it consist of? Of course, these are questions that we have been elaborating quite a lot today, especially in this morning. So I will not talk so much about it. But I will just pinpoint that it is a great challenge in finding a specific reference baseline. So I'll just show you these pictures on the left-hand side. That's a footprint from a creature living in the oceans 565 million years ago. And the other picture is an illustration from 147 million years ago. And on the right-hand side is an ecosystem outside the Norwegian coast a few years ago. So it's very difficult to find an exact baseline. And I thought it was quite interesting that Elliot also pointed out today that maybe you have to also take into account that the human impact has some effect, that you might even use a baseline that is the result of human impact. The second point is when we are talking about restoration, we have to be very cautious. There are so many examples on that human intervention has not been successful. And just to show you two examples, on the left-hand side here is a crayfish, and in lakes where the crayfish has gone, we have tried to re-establish with crayfish, but because you had not sufficient knowledge, you have also established crayfish which are suffering from infectious disease and making it a great disaster. The other example is well known from Australia, where some settlements in the 1860s would like to remind themselves of UK, and they introduced the rabbits, and in 10 years or something, 2 million rabbits was crowding Australia. So to intervene with nature is very challenging, and we have to be very cautious. But we have to, in order to restore, we have to have a baseline, a reference ecosystem. And I will just give you some example from Norway. And we have to define the baseline. In Norway, we have defined baseline around 1960 to 1990. And then you have to collect the data, the monitor, to assess and then manage. In Norway, we have established a quite comprehensive program called Mariano, where we're trying to map the seabed, and also in that, when we're mapping the depth and topography, also the biodiversity and pollutions. So that data that are providing from that program is very important to provide to many stakeholders. And we have established also so-called the Nature Index for Norway, which is an index trying to set the status, or trying to assess the status of the biodiversity in 9 different ecosystems. And the Nature Index is published every 5th year, and it is the result of summarizing of 301 indicators. And that, of course, that result is also providing as basis for the management plans for the Norwegian seas areas. We have worked with developing management plans for the seas, for the Norwegian oceans for 10 years. And the last one now was published in April this year. And the point with the management plans is, as we have heard a lot about today, it is to have a tool to, it's an advisory tool, but it's a tool in order to promote value creation from ocean-based industry, and at the same time try to maintain a healthy biodiversity. So those plans are extremely important for management authorities. Well, I'm going to talk about restoration. So it's quite appealing to use the doctor-patient analogy. And the ambition, as we know, is to have good environmental status of the ecosystem, and that's why we're going to restore it. So if we look into the doctor-patient analogy, we can consider the nature as a patient. Then we need long-term observation. We have to have a monitoration from the baseline. And we should work to try to prevent that the patient or the earth is getting damaged, the ecosystem getting damaged. And then, but if it is damaged or suffering, then we have to have good diagnostic tools in order to identify the problem precisely. And then, of course, we must treat the patient or the damaged ecosystem, try to restore it. So the question is, are there a lot of business opportunities? And I think that this today and yesterday clearly answered that there are huge opportunities in this area. I will just focus on a few, on preventive work and some treatment. What are you doing now? Yeah. We have heard quite a lot yesterday about the maritime industry and the regulation that are driving innovation. And I think that was very interesting, the different issues that was raised yesterday. I will just remind you of one of them, which is important, and that's the Ballast Water Management Convention, which enters into force just very recently. And of course, when you're considering that as much as maybe 7,000 species are traveling every day across the oceans, and according to a WWF report a few years ago, it caused the damage for aquaculture industry and fishing industry in a 5-year period for as much as 31 billion pounds. So, of course, when you have to when you can prevent this transportation, it will be of great significance for restoring ecosystems. And also at the same time, that will initiate new technical solutions, because most of the ships have to install specific equipments. And here are some 2 examples. And considering that there's 100,000 ships sailing international seas, then it's enormous potential market for the supply industry in this field. To prevent, in order to keep a good environmental status, it's also another example. It's also within the fishing industry. It is a big challenge with the so-called ghost fishing. That is that a lot of the fishermen lose their gears, and these gears are negative for the environment, polluting the environment, and also it's difficult for good management purposes. So we are supporting projects that are developing biodegradable gill nets, and we think that is also a way of preventing damage on the ecosystems, and that so that's one aspect of how to approach this. But sometimes it's not possible to restore the ecosystems. So what do we do? Is there any business opportunity then? One example, the king crab was put out in the waters by Russian scientists in the 1960s, I think. And it has not been possible to stop the spread of the king crab. It has changed the ecosystems, but also it has been a good opportunity. So we have developed a harvest industry, and last year we exported king crab for 46.3 million euro. Another problem, the ecosystems are changing. The sea urchins are creating seabed deserts across many parts of the world, and also in a great part of the northern coast in Norway. And we really don't know why, whether that's due to climate change or overfishing or whatever, but you can see the deserts is a problem. So we have different measures in trying to restore the kelp forest. The kelp forest has then been gone when the sea urchins came. So I will give you 3 examples on how to restore the kelp forest. First of all, we have tried, or it has been tried to construct artificial reefs. As you can see here on the left-hand side, that's a construction. And after a few years, we can see that the kelp is growing on it, and it's also helping to combat the sea urchin because the predators are able to hide in it. Second approach in order to restore the kelp forest, we have tried in a fjord far up north called Porsangerfjorden, with limining the seabed, and the seabed has been some success. So after a few years, there we can see restoration of the kelp and the fish recruitment. So we have to, of course, continue with that project. A third measure in order to restore or to combat this problem is to, again, the analogy to the king crab, try to harvest the sea urchin. And I guess maybe some of you have eaten this sea urchin. It should be delicious. I haven't eaten it myself, but it has apparently good price on the international seafood market. So there are several interesting projects going on in Norway to look into the possibility to establish and develop such an industry for harvesting, and then again keeping it in balance. So that was some approaches. Then also it was mentioned yesterday the significance of circular economy, where you try to use all of the resources so it will not damage the ecosystems. And we have talked so much about decommissioning of the offshore installation, so I will not talk about that, but just remind you of some other areas as well. Aquaculture has been mentioned. The aquaculture industry is a very big industry in Norway, and it of course also makes some sustainability problems with damaging locally on some of the ecosystems. But there's also a business opportunity in this, and we can see that there have been developing now, well, some companies are developing to try to recover the fish sludge, the solids beneath the aquaculture. And you can see one plant here on the right-hand side, and it's interested for fertilizing opportunities, and maybe it also might be an interest for bioenergy. Another big problem that you are all very much aware of is the plastic problems in the oceans. Can that be a business opportunity? Well, it's certainly a business opportunity if you are able to recycle the plastics before it enters into the oceans. I think we have to develop more measures in order to do that. But also when it has entered the oceans, there is some business or projects also in trying to recover some of the plastics. I think as much as 8 million tons of plastic annually is reaching the oceans. On the left-hand side here, you can see a lens from the cleanup project with this young Netherlands guy who is an enthusiastic person, Bob Slayton. He has got a lot of support now in order to recover the plastic, and in also business in Norway who are working with spills of the oil industry is trying to work within this plastic. And here underneath there's some shoes from Adidas, and do you know what that's made of? Plastic. 11 bottles, plastic bottles. So there are products for the recovery also. So all these very brief examples for restoration, business opportunities. Of course, it has a great demand for heavily investment in research. It's not only talking about one type of research, it's a lot of different research. It's basic applied research and to commercialization. It's not only about talking about technology and natural sciences, but also social sciences. Social science is very important also to try to assess the possibilities of introducing new products and to see what kind of measures are efficient. I think some of them people here earlier raised that issue. It's very important to have a knowledge-based approach in order to find what does function. I come from the Research Council of Norway, and we have an increased attention on sustainability. And we have financed a lot of different projects within this field that I've been talking about now. And we finance these projects through a lot of different mechanisms. There are specific programs. We have specific programs for developing sustainable ocean-based industries and also looking into the ecosystems. And we have centers of excellence, independent project infrastructures, very important, and also tax deduction schemes in order to mobilize industry. So it also calls for interdisciplinarity and cross-sectoral collaboration. So I think there is not only one answer, there you have a lot of different approaches that is a prerequisite in order to promote such a sustainable development. But as a financing agency, of course, we have influence by how we conduct our calls. And we have 1 billion euro annually, it's our budget, so I hope we can have a positive effect in promoting a more sustainable development. Finally, the question, policy for innovation, what is needed? As I said, I think it's a combination. We need both carrot and whips. We need a lot of different R&D measures. And also I would like to mention that we are always developing and looking for new measures, better mechanisms to finance research. And we are starting now or improving our collaboration with other funding agencies in order to fill the gaps on financial mechanisms. So you can finance an idea from the beginning to commercialization. And that we are specifically concerned when it comes to sustainable industries. And then another carrot, I would say, is funds. And I will mention this NOx fund that has been established in Norway. If you have too high emission on NOx, I don't know the exact limits, but if it exceeds, you have to pay a fee. And that fee is allocated to a fund, and then you can apply for the fund to get the support to develop low emission equipment. And that has been a very high success. It's very popular in the maritime sector. So that's one way of doing it. We were talking about the previous speaker, we're talking about what kind of mechanism. You can establish funds, fees, funds, and the funds you can apply afterwards. So that's a carrot. Then, of course, you have taxes. If you are polluting, you also have to pay for it. So there's different measures, I think. But what is very important to succeed, you have to have to share expectations and future visions from the different stakeholders. They cannot sit by themselves. So you must invite both the management, the managers of ecosystems, and also the different industries that are operating in the environment. and you should facilitate interactions between those stakeholders and operators. Coordination between ministries is extremely important. When we established and developed these management plans of the ocean, it was really one of the important effects was that you invited it's 5 different ministries that are all collaborating, and the ongoing scientific work and monitoring is also between different kind of institutions. So that is in order to try to reduce the conflicts of interest. You have to have scientific cooperation, and you have to cooperate also at the ministry level. Then finally, we have to be very reflexive when it comes to what we are doing. We are planning, we are doing, we have to check, we have to adjust. So that's again the social sciences. Somebody said the change of minds. You have to be willing to change your mind, to collaborate with somebody else, and you have to be willing to also take into account the results of science, because also science is developing. So I have really enjoyed being here and listening to you, and you said so many wise things, so I would like to close with what Massimo De Benedetti, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but I think his last sentence yesterday was something that the R&D funding is the key for a long-term successful sustainable development, and I thought that was very wise, so thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christina, because your presentation was very rich of examples, so we were able to combine some theory and the global systems to practical things that we do need, because we need to apply these things. There's some gorgeous, ideas that we wish we'd like to be able to use also in the debate, but it's a little bit more difficult of things. In any case, there is room for questions, and I'm sure that there are.
Christina, yes, thank you very much. It was a great presentation, very rich indeed. Norway is a striking example of a nation which is very well advanced in the development of its maritime strategy. I wonder to what extent you're trying to integrate some of the thinking you presented today in terms of ecosystem restoration, business opportunities and so on. Is that feeding into the national maritime strategy already?
We have just elected a new government. It was re-elected, and both the government and the opposition is very concerned about ocean, so it's high on the agenda. And when it comes to in all the different documents that are produced and what the politician says in lectures or whatever, they say that they should develop, stimulate an ocean-based industry, but it is within the level of what nature can handle. So there is, we have regulations. I think it went into force in 2009, where for instance, for fisheries, it should be ecosystem-based. And these management plans, they are based upon 2 principles: ecosystem-based and science. So there are a willingness in the Norwegians, also the politicians in the Norwegian population, that we should manage both, develop the ocean-based industries and taking care of the biodiversity. But of course there are discussions, and that depends on what kind of political party you are in, but that's a general point of view, so I don't know whether that answered your question. But being a funding agency, we have oceans very high on the agenda, and the sustainability approach is really putting emphasis on everything we do. Really putting emphasis. So a project that are promoting a more sustainable development has high priority.
Other questions? I do have one Yeah, indeed. There was another question here?
No.
Nice, because we do have very similar problems in the med that you noticed. For instance, the barriers created by sea urchins grazing that are creating deserts here, called the barriers. I don't know if you use the same term. And an exploitation of sea urchins in the difficult management. I've seen you use also sea urchin eggs that are fantastic with spaghetti, by the way. And in other cases, there's an exploitation of the big crabs that you showed, 56 million euros are big income. At the same time, to the best of my knowledge, if this would be the case here, I totally agree that these are reserves, but if it would be the case here, we will start fishermen enhancing the presence of invasive species to increase the market. So if this becomes an income, the egg species become reserves, they will, stimulate somehow the presence. So this could be risky. I mean, looking at the Mediterranean view of these opportunities, in some cases we intentionally introduce some species of clam, for instance, the Rutitapes filipidarum or whatever, the vongole that in the fantastic spaghetti. But so these are certainly policies. For instance, using fishermen to remove, some invasive species could be a solution. It could be an opportunity, but it could be also a trick. Do you have any evidence that there are solutions working better in the long span than others? Also, you showed the presence of artificial structure to enhance kelp, for instance, all those things. Are these solutions just prototypes, or are they part of a strategy at national level?
At the time being, it's only on research level. I mean, so I was just contacting the ones who had this project in the Porsanger Fjord, where they were eliminating the sea, and said, how is it now? And it's they said you have to keep on trying to continue this. So it's not been one fixed part, but so there's a lot of different research ongoing. We have not one solution yet.
There are no other questions. I will thank you once more. Thanks, Cecilia. And regarding Thorsten Thiel, Business Fellow, Institute of Global Affairs, London School of Economics. Thanks, Thorsten, for an important communication on what prospects for marine ecosystem restoration industry driven by science and innovation. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Roberto. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad to have had two excellent speakers before me who have outlined the context in which we are discussing the prospects for marine ecosystem restoration and delivery of an industry around that. My background is project finance, and I'm looking therefore at how we can use ocean ecosystems, support them through financial innovation so that we can deliver a sustainable blue economy. I will therefore talk briefly about the context where we see the advances and opportunities. And I think the first bullet point I have here is already the biggest opportunity right now, and David has already alluded to it. Green infrastructure for coastal resilience is a crucial way of looking at the way we will need to think about our coasts. This is not only because the delivery of coastal resilience, storm protection, and response to sea level rise is more effective using natural solutions and maybe cheaper than using traditional seawalls and grey infrastructure. It is also because in a changing coastal environment, nature is much better at adapting to that change. And so therefore, as sea level rises, natural systems will respond and move with that change, where, as we saw yesterday, rebuilding a Thames barrier every few years is a very expensive approach. So we need to look into green infrastructure as an investable proposition to understand exactly where and how it can be best applied. Now, to do that, we need science, and that's where a lot of the progress has been happening, in the combination of developing the science and the technology around it. I have been told by my science friends that they probably can fly LiDAR over a coastal area and pretty much forecast for the next 20 years where the parts of the coasts will be that will remain stable and could be the right spots for physical structures, and where the large parts of the coast will be that are changing rapidly. So having that knowledge, having that ability to measure and identify, allows us then to make much better planning decisions. And we spoke about marine spatial planning. That means in a coastal context, we then can identify areas where wetlands in themselves would be a useful use of that area. And we can then think about what these wetlands can actually deliver in a much broader context. So in addition to helping with resilience, so for instance, bringing down the strength of a storm, they can also be mitigation. So I'm involved with blue natural capital around mangroves. For instance, we saw that in David's slides, where there are large areas along the coasts of a number of Asian, African, Latin American countries have had their mangroves depleted, and where therefore a restoration of these natural systems is a very meaningful contribution to rebuilding that resilience, provided it is done in a way that deals both with these ongoing changes, but also fully takes into account what we now know from marine ecology and from an understanding. We had a first phase of use of these approaches where, say, you planted one type of mangroves. That is not the answer. You need to understand the biodiversity, the ecosystem structure. You need a detailed and understanding of these complex systems, and technology, sensors, additional measurings are all ways to help us in that front. I was involved with the EU Sense Ocean project, where we were working on deep ocean sensor packages that would integrate multiple measurements in one physical, adaptive, solid structure that could then provide that information up real time. So these are the innovation contributions linked with the science contributions that make the investment proposition around marine restoration more and more compelling. And these solutions address mitigation in terms of strengthening natural carbon sinks in particular, and especially as we identify and value these carbon sinks and deliver payments for carbon sinks, for ecosystem services, and more mature capital markets around that. So there are funding sources available to do that type of work. And we can look into runoffs, into biodiversity, into habitat structure. To throw just one number at you, the work ongoing in the Louisiana wetlands is looking at a 50 billion budget for wetlands restoration, which will lead to positive cash flows in excess of 8 billion a year at the end of the system. So we are not talking about just an expenditure. We're talking about an investment that makes sense. Now, this has obviously a significant number of implications for the local communities around that. So it provides local jobs and livelihoods, the ecosystem services, be it in the structures themselves, say oyster reefs, etc., be it in the management of marine protected areas, be it in coastal tourism and ecotourism. All of these are aspects that show that this is not just the right investment strategy, but it's also something that promotes blue jobs and blue growth. But it does require regulatory drivers that provide structural clarity how we are progressing in this area, and that take into account the scientific advances and the innovation technology advances, so that we make these investments once, so that we use technical infrastructure for multiple purposes based on a single investment decision. So what are the economics that lie behind this? I've quoted here two recent papers. The first came out just last month, which suggests that active marine restoration can be the most cost-effective approach. And it has a nice matrix of looking at whether the investment on land or the investment in the marine side of the land-sea area may be the most effective. So we are starting to see social science, economics, looking at the space and getting their head around it. Now, to do this requires, and this is my second quote here, new formal valuation approaches that take into account the multiple geographical temporal scales. So this is not simple or straightforward, but this is very much an emerging, interesting, and large space. And I call this blue natural capital economics, because that is really what is being developed here. It is showing that looking at the blue space is very much integral to the natural capital way of thinking. So the natural capital protocol, the way of valuing natural capital assets, are all tools that help us make decisions around these types of investment and asset opportunities. And it then creates a language that allows long-term investors, such as pension funds, etc., to understand that this is what we're talking about. These are investable asset classes. But we do need methodologies, and we need innovation around the cost-benefit analysis, so that we understand how to put these numbers onto these various choices we have as society, and to attract the private sector players in with the right financial incentives out of this. Which means not only an assessment of these coastal ecosystems for their relative relevance in terms of resilience, storm surge protection, and livelihoods, but also in terms of the metrics we use for this discussion, be it the cost per hectare for the restoration measures, the timescales in which these can be effective, and the various discount rates we apply as we look at these projects. And there's a whole developing economic discipline around the way discount rates would need to be applied in this world. And I think it is important for the whole blue economy space to take a look and understand and absorb what is happening in the climate finance and climate economy space, where a lot of these issues are being discussed, where we have a full framework around the Paris Agreement, where we have the Sustainable Development Goals. The Paris Agreement alone provides for very significant financing into adaptation and mitigation and support for the developing countries through the Green Climate Fund. The ocean and marine space is part of that structure, but at the moment we have not presented sufficient clear examples of these funding opportunities, so there's a great opportunity to do that. And obviously the benefits from the economic point of view of restoring fish stocks, of providing clean water, have huge impacts for local communities, for tourists alike. So therefore, I would postulate that the innovation and science we need also needs to be linked with finance breakthroughs. Finance is part of this, so this means a number of things. It means we need to look at the payment schemes for ecosystem services that can provide the right type of incentives for payments that ensure that the efforts we undertake enhance biodiversity and natural habitats, so that we take, and how do I switch that sign off? Sorry about that. I don't know where it came from, so Robert, did you know? Mouse, what's that here? Perfect. Thank you. So we talked about payment for ecosystem services. I'm secondly on the financing structures themselves. Be they linked to compensation payments and offsets that were mentioned, be they linked to bond type structures, whether it's environmental impact bonds or blue bonds, or are there insurance structures where the insurance companies will provide coastal insurance schemes that have different premia depending on the type of investment you undertake in protecting the space. We already heard earlier about property rights. There's a whole issue around how industry clusters and value chains evolve and how these can be encouraged also through public-private partnerships, so that we can address this issue at scale. Because risk sharing and funding mechanisms have a significant impact as to the possibility of growing this sector. If we're talking about high-risk propositions, the amount of money that will be made available is small and will be very much focused at the few opportunities that are likely to win out. We want a much broader funding landscape that takes into account these progress that we've made in understanding from a science and innovation point of view of what is needed, and that can be then addressed on this much broader scale. The reason the mouse doesn't. And there we are. So we are coming to my conclusion, which is to provide you with a number of the examples of where I can see this space. And I would suggest in the coastal space we have the opportunity right in front of us right now. I'm somewhat more hesitant to say that we know in the deep sea where we sit with this, and Roberto already referred to the paper in Nature that I was a co-author of, which suggested that we don't know enough yet to have an offset type strategy for the deep sea space. But in the coastal space, the blue natural capital approach is valid. I'm working with IUCN at standards where we can deliver that. I also believe that for the high seas, innovative finance mechanisms can be found to fund these larger type of infrastructures that can provide us the data both from satellite but also inside the seas, which would help on the science side and on the industry actor side. And so developing additional funding mechanisms, and one idea I proposed was an ocean sustainability bank, working with multilateral institutions to make them aware that the ocean space is one of their options for growth and activity is crucial. So ecosystem restoration is a way to promote an agenda that brings people more in line with what we learn about natural ecosystems, how we can work with them, and provided we listen to the scientists and conservationists so that we structure these approaches appropriately, there is a fundable opportunity here to take us forwards. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Indeed, I think certainly an added value with this part of view, and it's fantastic when we are with convergent views. So there is room for questions, please.
Thank you. It was a very good presentation. It gave me a lot of thought. I have a very, very simple question, and that is when you take up a loan, issue bonds and so on, then there must be a debtor who pays the interest, who pays the loan back. And as I see it, the only debtor can be the state or a local authority, and the way, the reason behind that is that when these entities have the power to write out taxes, and the tax base debt will rise because of employment and value creation. Am I right?
I think that is one way of paying it back. I don't think it's the only way. I think there are the challenge is to identify the beneficiaries from the strategy in a specific coastal area. And I think it is possible to work on that approach. So say if you are a company that is positioned in that area and you are likely to be flooded, you would like flood insurance. You can then have the option of your insurer saying, look, I'll just pay and I see what happens. Or your insurer says, just like with your personal insurance now, where you can say, I go to the gym twice a week and therefore I pay lower premium. Here you would say, I support the seagrass planting project that out here, which my scientists have told me will reduce the likelihood that my particular area will get flooded, and therefore I pay a lower premium. So private sector participation in these payment streams is possible, is feasible, but it will vary under the various examples that we can find.
On what you said in the end about the necessity to have observatories that can network the information and so on. I just want to bring to the forum the fact that there is an initiative under the G7 work group to promote increased political actions around these themes and to support additional actions for routine ocean observations. And I do not want to go into the detail of this, as there is a paper that's being prepared to address this and communicate this to the group. However, I just want to make this group aware of this initiative, and perhaps there could be an alignment to be underlined or just to be noticed. And for any further information, you can refer to Mark or to the we're organizing this workshop here in Naples just a few months ago.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, because this is one of my topics close to my heart. I've funded subsea cables in the past, and I didn't mention it in this talk, but it's absolutely true that cooperation between the science community and the telecommunications industry is one of the ways where you have this multi-use approach, which would be significantly cheaper than the traditional approach. Traditionally, a science deep sea observatory is put out at sea and the cable runs out and back and costs you hundreds of millions. The same telecommunications cable runs blind through the ocean, has no sensors on board, and is not connected to this observation platform. So if we can develop future deep sea cables as we design them and link them to future deep ocean observatory infrastructures and make the observatory infrastructures the customers of the deep sea cable, we have a much lower capital expenditure for the physical telecoms infrastructure and a much stronger opportunity. I looked at a particular example in the Pacific. The extra cost from a telecoms point of view was about 10% of the project. The benefits for the observatory were significant. So I congratulate you on your effort in this area. This is an area we need to keep pushing. I'm part of an ITU working group on smart sensors. It needs further support and interaction between these various industries, and it's a very good example of where we can show that global data infrastructure is a significant opportunity and can be delivered more effectively in cooperation between the public and the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you for your economics specifically with ecosystem restoration that I appreciate very much. In the middle of your presentation, you made a very strong statement, which is that active restoration is the most cost-effective approach for ecosystem preservation. As far as I remember, that paper was published in Zoologica, which is a journal, only assessed shallow and coastal water research projects. As we have been seeing from David's presentation and others, as you referred in your last slide, the deep sea may be a totally different case where these very strong statements may not be applicable. In a previous paper led by Anton Dohrn and others, there was some back-of-the-envelope calculations where the cost of deep sea restoration was several orders of magnitude greater per hectare compared to shallow water or terrestrial restoration projects. So my question is, if you are aware of the economic analysis that takes the benefit of deep sea activities from bottom trawling to deep sea mining and the likely cost of restoration.
I'm glad you clarified that point. I'm trying to make exactly that distinction. I'm saying, look at the port of Rotterdam. Bechtel built out the wetlands there for regulatory reason, but also because we had proof it was cheaper. So we have clear examples in the coastal space where green infrastructure can be the better choice. Similarly, I think we have very clear information from deep sea scientists that tell us we do not have the data to make that kind of assessment. And if I did in the deep sea space, and in fact if I did it on the back of an envelope, I would probably come to the conclusion that it is not foreseeable for me that, say, restoring a deep sea seamount is a viable financial proposition compared to just stopping fishing, in particular if at the same time I'm looking at the next WTO meeting where we have a strong discussion around how high the illegal or unnecessary fishing subsidy level is, and if we took those off, maybe that fishing wouldn't even take place. So I think we can make that very clear distinction, and I find it helpful actually to make that because I think it makes it much easier to progress with ecosystem and natural solutions in the coastal sphere quickly, rather than having that embroidered in the scientific debate about what is happening in the deep sea.
Thanks. So we're perfect time, and I ask the moderator to come here. And thanks again for and the last talk of the day is the workshop, so a big responsibility for you. Is to have moderators from the Department of Oceanography and Fisheries, University of Azores, Portugal, and we talk about prospects of future deep sea restoration activities. So we mentioned quite a few times deep sea, and it's so nice.
Here we go again.
Here we go.
Thank you, Roberto. So I was asked to give an overview of the business opportunities in the realm of deep sea restoration, and I think the coastal part of the restoration opportunities were well covered in the previous talks. David Bille also gave a very nice overview of what are the main issues in the deep sea context. So I'm kind of leading this discussion on if deep sea restoration, if the society decides that deep sea restoration is to be done, the question is how can that be done? And of course, what would be the cost, the spatial scales, and the time scales? And we are exploring all these issues under your Horizon 2020 funded project called MERCIS, that is led by Roberto. And instead of me explaining what MERCIS is, and before going into the deep sea restoration component of the project and the advances that we have made, I have asked Norberto to present the project.
I told him not to do that. MERCIS project is the first project in Europe devoted to the restoration of waves. Marine ecosystems are impacted by human activities. During the last 30 years, human activities are destroying shores. We are fishing, we are reducing biodiversity, we are reshaping the marine seafloor and the marine ecosystems. It's time to restore marine ecosystems.
Why restoration is important to society? It's very simple. When critical ecosystems that we depend on are no longer providing suitable habitat for life and not providing the ecosystem services on which we depend, humanity must behave in a restorative fashion. Do we want to move towards a planet in repair, or do we want to continue treating the Earth as if it were a business in liquidation? The subject of this consortium, MERCIS, is about the marine environment. We need to change our consumption behavior patterns, we need to improve our technologies, and we need to invest a lot more in ecological restoration. I vote that we work towards a planet in repair.
Okay, this is the MERCIS project in brief. It is composed by several case studies, mostly in shallow water. And there is a work package dedicated to the deep sea. And I don't have to go through this. Hello? Okay. I don't have to go into these topics with much detail, but hello. Okay, there you go. So deep sea, as you have heard today already, is the largest biome on Earth. It provides important goods and services, not only food resources, but it may also in the future produce some mineral resources of interest for, as David presented, produce new technology applications. But it also has important role in climate regulation. As you have seen and discussed during this workshop, human pressures are increasing, and they are also increasing in the deep sea. The mean depth of fishing has increased over the last 50 years. There's lots of fishing out there that is now as deep as 2,000 meters in depth. There is this new prospect for biomaterials and also for the mineral exploitation, and all of these activities have impacts in the ecosystem, and they act cumulatively. And as it was said in the previous talk, marine conservation is better achieved if you combine certain measures for protection and also certain measures for habitat restoration. So in the recent years, and when I say recent years, it's really over the last 3-4 years that the restoration discussion has moved into the deep sea context. There has been calls to start discussing the restoration of the deep sea and putting that into the political agenda. But as far as we know, it has never been tried in the deep sea, which may be a good thing, creating business opportunities in the future if the society again decides that this is the way to go. We had done in 2014 a very brief analysis of the principles of restoration and how could those principles be applied in the deep sea, and in theory the principles can be applied. So there is some room for applying what has been done and learned in coastal and terrestrial areas in the past and try to apply that into the deep sea. And this is basically the main goal of the work package on deep sea restoration of the MERCES project. So, I will show you briefly what we have done in terms of hands-on restoration activities. And those restoration activities, for those of you familiar with the restoration science, they can be divided into different things. And we here divided into two main aspects. One is natural regeneration, can be spontaneous or assisted regeneration, and the other group is assisted restoration. And the assisted restoration is really when you go down to the seafloor of your deep sea ecosystem and start playing with the ecosystem itself and changing things and planting stuff. And I will show you some examples of the different things that the MERCES project is doing, and may at the end of the project develop new methodologies that can then be used by the industry to apply deep sea restoration in the deep sea. So the first example has been led by Ifremer. And the concept here is, imagine an hydrothermal vent that has been mined for SMS deposits, seafloor massive sulfide deposits. So the idea here is to see if the community can restore, regenerate naturally, and if there are ways of increasing the speed of the regeneration of the hydrothermal vent communities. And one of the things that Ifremer is doing these days is to remove predation, and try to see if removed predation will increase the rate of recolonization and restoration of the benthic communities. Of course, the question here will be if there will be hydrothermal vents left after deep sea mining occur, but that's another question, and we don't want to go into that discussion now. So, partners from NOC and the Area Watt are deploying these massive structures, and you can see the size of a man there compared to the size of the structure, to see if areas that have been impacted by mostly fishing can regenerate faster if we deploy structures that will help the megafauna communities to come back. And this has been done also with natural components like land-based products, wood, or even kelp. And this work has been led by Area Watt, Andrew Sweetman, and basically you're testing if land-based materials can also again speed up the colonization process of deep sea fauna. As we have discussed yesterday and today, the role of oil and gas infrastructures in restoring the deep sea is being evaluated by Dan Johns, and this is feeding the discussion of the decommissioning or not of this deep sea oil structures, and the idea is to quantify the contribution of these structures to restoration or recolonization of the deep sea. Finally, this is the last example. Is being conducted in the Azores, where I'm based, and also in the Mediterranean, which is, imagine a place that has been impacted by deep water fishing for a while. It could be longlining or troll, or an area that will be impacted by deep sea mining in the future, that damages your vulnerable marine ecosystems, coral sponges, or whatever you feel like is important for your ecosystem. How can you then restore those communities after being impacted? And one of the approaches that we are tackling here is we are working closely with our fishermen in the Azores. In their regular fishing activities, they catch as a bycatch product cold water corals and sponges that they kept them alive in their boats. They bring those to our lab. We maintain them in our lab, and from one colony we then break them into different other colonies that we place in landers that you see on your right-hand side. And then we deploy back to the deep sea, as you can see in these figures. And then the idea is to, at this first step of the experiment, to quantify things, easy variables such as survival, growth, and then the condition of the animals. I will just show one more slide with results of this experiment. And the very preliminary results tell us that survivability of the species that we have tried so far is quite high. And that growth, and this experiment was, or these measures were taken about 14 months after deployment of the structures. Growth is slow as expected, but comparable with our control, with the growth rates that we expect from the literature. You see there lots of figures. I don't want to go into the detail here, but basically corals were deployed in this particular case in areas that naturally have high density, medium and low density of corals, and the results basically show that if you want to restore, you have to do your restoration actions really where there are the environmental conditions that naturally favor those communities to live, and the survival and the growth rate in the low density were significantly lower than in other of the cases. And in each of those figures you have different colonies of corals, ones that were impacted by fisheries, ones that were impacted by deep sea mining sediment plumes, and others that were impacted by both. And at the end of the day, the result shows that the colonies that were impacted by fishing were by far the ones showing lower survival rates and compared to the colonies that were healthy. So there's lots of factors to take into account when doing these transplantation techniques. Before I wrap up, and I have just one more slide, I just want to highlight that the work that Mercies is doing in terms of deep sea restoration basically wants to evaluate the techniques that could be applied in restoring deep sea ecosystem, and does not want to tell the message that you can go out there, do whatever you want, that we will fix it later. That is not a message, and we have to say it clear in every talk we give. So deep sea restoration is something new. It's novel. There's lots of challenges. As it has been mentioned in this workshop before, things grow very slow. It takes a substantial amount of time. The impact are in scales of magnitude as big as the United States. Can we restore the United States? No, for sure we can't. So there's lots of challenges that need to be addressed. It's risky because the probability of failure and things that you don't control are extremely high, and it's expensive, as we have discussed in the past, in the previous talks. So at the end of the day, deep restoration of the deep sea may be required at certain spatial scales for specific communities, and may in the future, or at least I hope in the future, will be something that not only the deep sea mining industry will be thinking of, but also any type of activity that impacts somehow the deep sea. And because of this, it may create business opportunities in the future. And when you say in the future, it may take 10 years, 20 years or more. But I have the feeling, and just, of course, just a feeling, there's no bioeconomic analysis on that deep sea restoration will be a reality in the future. So thank you very much. Before I wrap up, I just want to show you two faces. One is Andrew Sweetman, which is co-leading this specific work package on restoration of the deep sea, and Marina, which is leading the transplantation experiment in the Azores and is helping us out coordinating this work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Danny, because you actually showed that this huge challenge can be possibly very soon feasible, and I also have an idea of the implication costs. So, are there questions for Danny?
Thank you. I enjoyed very much your presentation. The point I want to make, I think, cuts across several of the presentations today on restoration. And people seem to be particularly focusing on efficacy of different methods, whether passive or active restoration, about the costs of restoration in deep water and shallow water. One of the things I'm wondering is whether people are also looking at, and I should say that it was mentioned in passing this morning by a couple of speakers, the environmental costs of repair. In other words, we're looking, for example, at the examples of structures for oil and gas drilling, and the options open to restore the environments at the end of lifetime. There was people were talking about total removal versus cutting, and then allowing a part to fall on the seabed and form a reef. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And similarly, I'm thinking some of the repairs that we may want to do may have some environmental costs. And I was wondering whether you intend to sort of try and measure these or consider these in the work that you're doing.
That's an excellent point, an excellent question. And in the lifetime of mercies, which I presented, it will be unlikely that we measure the environmental cost of deep sea restoration. The main focus here is first to evaluate if it can be done from a both theoretical and practical point of view. Although we have been discussing that issue among the community, and one easy example is we will not be able to restore the full ecosystem, the full community, the full services and the functions. And if we decide, or the society decide that, for example, the corals may be restored, at the end of the day we may end up with a total different state in the ecosystem compared to the origin ecosystem. And that's something that we have been discussing in the sense that marine restoration can, in fact, alter the ecosystem itself when you compare to the original state. And that is of serious concern, and it's in the discussion. And I think at the end of the day will be to the society to decide if the cost of altering the system overcomes the benefit of restoring some key species or habitats. But to repeat, the answer is no, we are not addressing, unfortunately. We detail that part of your question in the Mercies project, but it's something that we are thinking of in the back of our minds.